What's going on, guys? So today we'll be looking at why Dennis Rodman should have been the 1996 NBA Finals MVP, an award which was given to Michael Jordan. But before we do so, it is important to clarify that the NBA Finals MVP is an award presented to the most impactful player of the NBA Finals, which is between 4 to 7 games. It does not count the regular season, nor does it factor in the first 3 rounds of the playoffs. So now that we've clarified what a Finals MVP is, let's first examine the Finals performance of the 1996 Chicago Bulls team by the numbers, which will then lead to Dennis Rodman and his true impact out on the court. When comparing the 1996 NBA Finals efficiency numbers of both the Chicago Bulls and the Seattle SUPERSONICS, it is easy to conclude that the SUPERSONICS were by far the more efficient team, beating the Chicago Bulls in field goal percentage, 3-point percentage, 2-point percentage, free throw percentage, effective field goal percentage, and true shooting percentage. In fact, the efficiency, or lack thereof, that the Chicago Bulls displayed in the 1996 NBA Finals was not only their most inefficient NBA Finals performance of any of the 6 Chicago Bulls championship teams, but also one of the worst of any champion in NBA history. When looking at this graphic, which highlights the efficiency of all of the NBA champions since the 1979-1980 season, which is known as the modern era, it is clear that the 1996 Chicago Bulls ranked dead last, making them the most inefficient NBA champions of the modern era. Furthermore, when the champions from the 1970s are added, which is pre-modern era, the 1996 Chicago Bulls still find themselves at the very bottom in efficiency. And it is only when the primitive years of the NBA are taken into account, which were the 1950s and 1960s, that the 1996 Chicago Bulls no longer find themselves at the bottom in efficiency, but now rank 55th out of 67 NBA champions. So the 1996 Chicago Bulls were not only more inefficient than the 1996 Seattle SuperSonics, but they were also the most inefficient NBA champions of the modern era and could be considered arguably as the most inefficient championship team in NBA history. Michael Jordan, who led all players in scoring, averaging 27.3 points per game, did so while shooting 41.5% from the field, which was not only his worst shooting performance in his 6 finals appearances, but also one of the worst in his playoff career, ranking 35th in terms of efficiency out of the 37 playoff series he's played in. But this one specific performance wasn't just bad by Michael Jordan standards, but by Finals MVP standards as well. And when it is compared to all of the other Finals MVPs in NBA history, we see that Michael Jordan's performance in the 1996 NBA Finals ranks second to last amongst Finals MVPs in both field goal percentage and effective field goal percentage. The only other Finals MVP that has been more inefficient in an NBA Finals series than Michael Jordan was Tim Duncan, whose 2005 Finals MVP should have gone to Manu Ginobili, as was shown in a previous video. But this bad shooting performance in the 1996 NBA Finals wasn't specific to just Michael Jordan, but Scottie Pippen as well, whose shooting performance was also the worst of his 6 NBA Finals and the 3rd worst shooting performance of his overall playoff career, ranking 41st in terms of efficiency out of the 43 playoff series he's played in. So it's then no surprise that the 1996 NBA Finals marked the only time where Scottie Pippen, being the second option, was ever outscored by the opposing team's second option in an NBA Finals series. Or that Toni KUKOC, who had been named the 6th Man of the Year and who was Chicago's 3rd leading scorer, was also outscored by Seattle's 3rd option in deadlift shrimp on better efficiency. Steve Kerr, who is still statistically the NBA's most efficient 3-point shooter of all time and who was a great role player off the bench for the Bulls, had the 2nd worst playoff shooting performance of his career, shooting 30.3% from the field, which included tying his playoff career low of 18.2% from 3. This was also a series in which Ron Harper, who was the Chicago Bulls' starting point guard and one of their best perimeter defender, was injured playing in just 3.5 games. But the Seattle SuperSonics didn't just play like the better offensive team, they believed it as well. In an interview reflecting on the 1996 NBA Finals, Gary Payton stated that the Seattle SuperSonics were very confident in their ability to beat the Chicago Bulls, as they had been one of only 9 teams who had been able to beat them during their record-setting 72-10 regular season. So when the Chicago Bulls' historically bad offensive struggles during the 1996 NBA Finals are taken into account, which began with its 2 best players and filtered down, as well as certain injuries, this then begs the question, how were the Chicago Bulls still able to win the 1996 NBA Finals in spite of these shortcomings? In Game 1 of the NBA Finals, the Chicago Bulls were able to take a 24-18 first quarter lead behind Luke Longley's 8 points, which was then countered by a 16-7 run by Seattle to take a 34-31 lead halfway through the second quarter. It was at that time that Dennis Rodman would then force an offensive foul on Deadlift Shrimp, which would be his 3rd, sending him to the bench for the remainder of the first half, and sparking a 13-9 run by the Chicago Bulls, which included key plays in which Dennis Rodman was able to secure possessions with his rebounding while frustrating SHAWN KEMP on the defensive end. But after the Sonics made another run to bring the score to 44-43 in favor of the Bulls, with about 1.5 left in the second quarter, it was Dennis Rodman who helped open up the game for the Chicago Bulls by causing Sonics forward Frank Brickowski to flagrantly foul him on an offensive rebound attempt, which was then followed by 2 technical fouls on the part of Brickowski, leading to his ejection.
Could be losing it. Now he's applauding the call. Rodman was about to get involved and then walked away.
Joe Crawford is going to call a flagrant foul here on Frank Brickowski.
So, Dennis Rodman, who has had his ups and downs at the line, is able to hit the first for his first point of the night.
Brickowski looking to box out, looking to keep Rodman off, but just moved over with the forearm, with the elbow to the upper midsection. Very dangerous play, uncalled for.
And now Judd Bushler replaces Dennis Rodman. The conversation continues. And a technical has been called on Brickowski. And he's been called a double technical on Frank Brickowski. Apparently Joe Crawford feels that the intent of Brickowski was to instigate something against Rodman. Brickowski now walking in the direction of a couple of Bulls, and he's joined by a security man and is ushered back to the locker room.
And they got a couple of parting shots to referee Joe Crawford, and then one final parting shot to, I'm sure, Jack Haley sitting on the bench.
An absolutely uncalled for situation by Brickowski, who's a good, skilled basketball player who sometimes gets too caught up in the physical aspect of the game. But he has a flagrant foul and then 2 technicals. We're going to just see a parade to the line for Chicago. And Seattle worked so hard to get back in this game offensively. Now Chicago with a chance to open it up a bit here.
This gave the Chicago Bulls 3 extra points, which were followed by 2 more points caused by the over-aggressive defense of the SuperSonics on Michael Jordan, who scored 12 of his 18 first-half points in the second quarter to help the Chicago Bulls take a 53-48 lead going into the half. In the third quarter, where the Seattle SuperSonics outscored the Chicago Bulls 29-26, it was once again Dennis Rodman, along with the other role players, who kept the Bulls in the game by great plays on both ends of the floor. Whether it was a touchdown pass from Dennis Rodman to Scottie Pippen, which led to a 3-point play, a great two-man game between KUKOC and Rodman, which led to 4 easy points for the Chicago Bulls, or an offensive foul by SHAWN KEMP caused by none other than Dennis Rodman.
They try to do it off the dribble against Pippen. Rodman goes down, and the foul on Kemp. That's his fourth.
Again, the size differential, the guys darting up over the top of.
And in the fourth quarter, it was Toni KUKOC who took over the game offensively by scoring 12 of his 18 points in the fourth quarter, while Ron Harper and Scottie Pippen took over the game defensively with key defensive stops, while Dennis Rodman once again forced SHAWN KEMP into committing his 6th foul, taking him out of the game and helping the Chicago Bulls seal the victory.
Previous 5 shots before that jumper by Perkins. KUKOC. A potential 4-point. KUKOC with the crowd looking for the foul on SCHREMPF. And that will put KUKOC back. But a long way to go. This is only game number 1. The steal by Harper.
Pressure on this Chicago Bulls defense. Careless play once again by Seattle.
And Pippen with the steal. Open look for Harper and gave it up. Rodman back on the floor.
Size, too much athletic ability for Chicago.
KUKOC from Jordan.
Has picked it up.
12 of his 18 here in the fourth. Harper has had an outstanding night with the steal. Longley. Oh, look like Rodman just went down. Joe Crawford taking a long look. SHAWN KEMP has fouled out. Here's another look at it.
A totally unnecessary play. All of them hooked up there. Frustration by SHAWN KEMP. Just let that one go. You got to play above the antics of Dennis Rodman.
In the first half of Game 2, it was Michael Jordan who led the way for the Chicago Bulls, scoring 16 points on 6 of 11 shooting, while adding 5 assists to give the Chicago Bulls a 1-point lead going into the half. However, in a second half in which Michael Jordan shot just 3 of 11 from the field, it was Dennis Rodman who was the spark plug for the Chicago Bulls, grabbing 10 rebounds in the third quarter and helping the Chicago Bulls outscore the Seattle SUPERSONICS 30-20.
Longley getting position. Rodman. Dennis Rodman with a Harper for 3. And Rodman with a nice tip. Now they get back. Pippen for 3. Rodman with the save, but he stepped out. Apparently pushed out. So the foul call. Jordan. And kept alive by Rodman. Oh, Pippen with a beautiful delivery, leading. Defensive specialist. His 5th year at New Mexico State. Dennis Rodman has turned it around off the boards in this third quarter. He has 13 rebounds, 7 of the 13 in the third. Scottie Pippen. Rodman again.
What is SHAWN KEMP doing? SHAWN KEMP has got to spend 50% of his time thinking about boxing out Dennis Rodman. George Karl forced to call a timeout.
This would then continue well into the fourth quarter, where the Supersonics made a run and came within 3 points, but unfortunately could not keep Dennis Rodman off the boards, as he proved to be dominant by not only grabbing a total of 20 rebounds for the game, 11 of which were offensive to tie an NBA Finals record, but also by hitting a clutch free throw with less than 5 seconds left to give the Chicago Bulls a 4-point lead and the victory.
KUKOC for 3. And Rodman with another offensive rebound.
That Shawn Kemp just does not block out. He goes for the ball.
That's 10 offensive rebounds for Rodman. One off the all-time record for the NBA Finals, held by the Big E, Elvin Hayes. Brown now doing it. And Ron Harper is back on the Chicago bench. Rodman blocked. And a foul. It's on the 24. And Kerr fires for 3. Rodman with the offensive rebound. And that ties an NBA Finals record. 11 on the offensive glass for Rodman, and that was a big one. Foul is called to stop the clock with 15 and 8/10 seconds remaining. That left Schrempf called for the personal.
Mark, Seattle just...
So the Bulls get back to the Seattle front court as Pippen misses on both. Rodman able to get a jump ball out of it. However, it's only a 3-point game. That was almost an air ball by Scottie Pippen.
And Seattle failing to take care of its deepening in, and he's initiating the contact, but he's doing it with his left arm, his inside arm.
Well, let's see. Well, we need a hat trick. And it's controlled by Jordan. And now the bench. Well, Pippen missed 2. Now Rodman missing. Only 3 and 7/10 seconds to go in the fourth. And Rodman is able to hit for a 4-point lead. Perkins fires it down for Schrempf, and that will do it. The Chicago Bulls escape with the victory.
Game 3 of the NBA Finals was dominated by the Chicago Bulls, as they were able to take an 18-point lead after the first quarter, which became a 24-point lead by halftime, and eventually a 22-point victory. This was done behind a dominant performance by Michael Jordan, who scored 27 points in the first half and 36 overall to lead all scorers, while Dennis Rodman continued to give the Chicago Bulls the mental edge by frustrating Frank Brickowski into committing a flagrant 2 foul, which again led to his ejection.
Get involved. It looks like Pavetta has given the ejection sign. This has been brewing the last couple of minutes. I think he's thrown both out of the game. Brickowski ejected, flagrant foul 2. I thought Pavetta indicated that both were tossed. Let's see.
Well, this has been brewing ever since these two have gotten on the floor there, as this time Brickowski does get that forearm and elbow right into the Adam's apple of Dennis Rodman. But George Karl, who was ridiculing Rodman for all the things that he was getting away with after Game 1, had nothing but praise for Dennis Rodman after Game 2. I think we're going to hear more ridiculing after this one.
Dick Pavetta gave
In a Game 5 which was much more competitive, the Seattle SuperSonics were once again able to avoid the sweep and hold off the Chicago Bulls as they were led by SHAWN, who scored 22 points and grabbed 10 rebounds. In Game 6 of the NBA Finals, the Chicago Bulls were able to take a lead going into the half in spite of Michael Jordan shooting 3 of 11 from the field, but still contributed in other ways, adding 4 assists, 6 rebounds, and 2 steals, while the rest of the team shot an efficient 14 of 29 from the field, giving the Bulls a 45-38 lead. This halftime lead was also made possible by Dennis Rodman's activity on the glass, as well as his great defense as he baited Sam Perkins, Shawn Kemp, and Deadlift Shrimp into committing early fouls in the second quarter.
Perkins under control, too far away from the basket, double team not necessary.
And Rodman took a poke in the head from Shrimp. For Deadlift his first. And a new 24. Holding out play. It led to the offensive foul. Illegal pick set by Kemp trying to free up the man with the ball, Shrimp.
And in the second half, when Michael Jordan would continue in his shooting struggles, going just 2 of 8 from the field, while the rest of the team shot 12 of 30 from the field, it was Dennis Rodman who single-handedly took over the game on both offense and defense in the third quarter, when it looked like Seattle might be fighting its way back, and led the Chicago Bulls on a 16-4 run, allowing them to stretch their lead to 17 at 64-47. During this stretch, Dennis Rodman drew an offensive foul on Hershey Hawkins, scored a basket after grabbing an offensive rebound, and then scored on a reverse layup after getting fouled by Deadlift Shrimp on a fast break.
Spread the floor, Pippen for Rodman on the right. And a catch.
This was then followed by Shawn Kemp committing an offensive foul on Dennis Rodman, which led to a great assist pass from Dennis Rodman to Michael Jordan for the reverse layup, giving the Chicago Bulls their largest lead of the game at 64-47.
Have a 15-point lead.
Now, in spite of an 11-3 run by the Sonics at the end of the third quarter that brought the game back to within 9 points, it was Dennis Rodman who once again kept the game out of reach in the fourth quarter, starting with his record-setting activity on the offensive board, which led to a frustration foul on the part of Shawn Kemp, and then it was Dennis Rodman once again who made 2 great assist passes to TONI KUKOC, one for the corner 3 and one for the 3 at the top of the key from the high post, putting the game out of reach and giving the Chicago Bulls their 4th NBA championship.
Triple post, you see the action away from the ball, the antithesis of what Seattle does. The split on the ball side.
Jordan. Rodman and Perkins in the battle. It is called a jump ball.
Not been a terrific comeback team in these playoffs. When they played as the leader, they've been super.
Oh, Dennis Rodman with the one-hand rebound for his 17th, and he threw the... We're in the final second. The Chicago Bulls have won the 95-96 NBA championship.
So as we look back at games 1 through 6, we see that while Michael Jordan was certainly the MVP of Game 3, Dennis Rodman was the MVP of Games 2 and 6. And although many may think that Michael Jordan was the MVP of Game 1, the truth is that despite the numbers, his performance in that game wasn't as dominant or as distinctive as his Game 3 performance. In fact, when looking back at Game 1, there is a case to be made for other players as MVPs of that game. Whether it's Toni KUKOC, who took over the game in the 4th quarter, where he scored 12 of his 18 points, or Ron Harper and Scottie Pippen, who not only filled up the stat sheet, but also had key defensive stops in the closing minutes, and Dennis Rodman, who provided the mental edge as well as great overall defense. In fact, even though it was only a 2-point game going into the 4th quarter, the Chicago Bulls were playing so well as a team that Michael Jordan did not even score until the last 2 minutes of that quarter, when the game had already been decided with the Chicago Bulls up by 13 points. This is why George Karl, when talking about the MVP of the series after Game 3, was quoted as saying, "It's a coin toss between Michael and Dennis." Because even he was able to see that while Games 2 and 3 were dominated by Dennis Rodman and Michael Jordan respectively, Game 1 was an all-around team effort for the Chicago Bulls. But it was Dennis Rodman's defense and record-setting performance in the deciding Game 6 that gave him the edge over Michael Jordan, who had an underwhelming performance, shooting just 5 of 19 from the field, while also adding 7 assists and 9 rebounds. But when looking back at the series as a whole, what we also notice is that the testimony of the Seattle SuperSonics players always came back to one specific individual, that being Dennis Rodman, which explains how the Chicago Bulls could have overcome Michael Jordan and Scottie Pippen having their worst NBA Finals performance and the 3rd most inefficient playoff series of both of their careers, or Steve Kerr having the 2nd worst playoff shooting performance of his career, which included tying his playoff career low from 3, and starting point guard Ron Harper playing in just 3 games due to injury. The only way the Chicago Bulls were able to negate all of these flaws, which also included being the most inefficient NBA champions of the modern era, was by having the greatest rebounder of the modern era giving them extra possessions. And that's what's taken for granted when looking at Dennis Rodman, not only in light of this series, but also in light of NBA Finals history, as his offensive rebounding set the record for the most offensive rebounds in a single NBA Finals game. Now, while many may point out that Elvin Hayes was also able to grab 11 offensive rebounds in an NBA Finals game, there is one big difference, in that Elvin Hayes' offensive rebounding did not impact winning, as his team not only lost that game 105-95 to the Seattle SuperSonics, but also lost that NBA Finals series as well. Meanwhile, Dennis Rodman not only managed to do it twice in an NBA Finals series, making this feat all the more impressive, but actually won both games and the NBA championship. The argument against Michael Jordan is that his scoring impact in general wasn't greater than Dennis Rodman's rebounding impact. Because the impact that Michael Jordan's scoring usually provides was nullified by his inefficiency, which was a byproduct of Seattle's great perimeter defense that turned Michael Jordan into nothing more than a volume shooter. And it was Dennis Rodman's historic offensive rebounding that kept buying the Chicago Bulls possessions, which negated many of their misses and created second chance points as well as huge momentum swings. But even with all of that being said, there are still 2 specific arguments that many people always revert back to when trying to make a case against Dennis Rodman. The first argument oftentimes used is centered around the fact that Shawn Kemp was able to put up great statistical numbers in spite of Dennis Rodman guarding him, thereby diminishing his overall defensive impact. And while Shawn Kemp did have a great NBA Finals series offensively, the biggest misconception when dealing with this argument comes from the assumption that Dennis Rodman was the primary defender on Shawn Kemp. It was Luke Longley who had been given the task of guarding Shawn Kemp as much as possible to keep Dennis Rodman out of early foul trouble. And when looking at this graphic, which displays Shawn Kemp's productivity in relation to whoever was guarding him, we clearly see that the majority of Shawn Kemp's points throughout the series came when Luke Longley was his defender and not Dennis Rodman. But even when Dennis Rodman was the main defender, the totality of his defensive impact on Shawn Kemp went beyond the stat sheet. Whether it was omitting that Shawn Kemp, who fouled out of Game 6, committed 4 of his 6 personal fouls on Dennis Rodman, or that it was Dennis Rodman's hustle and intangibles throughout the series that not only frustrated Shawn Kemp, but the Seattle SUPERSONICS team as a whole. The second argument used against Dennis Rodman is the one which argues in favor of Michael Jordan simply because of his greater overall statistics during that series. But to argue for numbers alone and statistics is to go against what was clearly visible through the eye test, which was Dennis Rodman's brilliance on the defensive end and his historical dominance on offense with his rebounds. And although numbers and statistics are extremely useful and necessary, they're not always the best determinant for impact. In the 1978 NBA Finals, the Washington Bullets were able to win the NBA championship by beating the Seattle SUPERSONICS in a grueling 7-game series. And while Elvin Hayes and Bob Dandridge led Washington in scoring by averaging 20 points a game for the series, neither of these players were named as the Finals MVP. That award went to none other than Wes Unseld, who only averaged 9 points and 11 rebounds per game for that series. And what the MVP voters understood then is what the MVP voters in 1996 failed to realize. And that is that impact is the primary standard by which an NBA Finals MVP should be chosen, and not numbers. And no other players in NBA Finals history embodied that as much as Wes Unseld in 1978 and Dennis Rodman in 1996. But Dennis Rodman's impact for the Chicago Bulls in the 1996 NBA Finals was nothing more than the culmination of what he had been doing for the Bulls all season long, leading the league in rebounds per game, both defensive and offensive, while also helping the Chicago Bulls out-rebound their opponent more so than any other team in the NBA that season. And as was mentioned earlier in the video, while Gary Payton and the Seattle SUPERSONICS were confident in their ability to beat the Chicago Bulls because they had beaten them in the regular season, there was one variable they hadn't taken into account. That being Dennis Rodman, who hadn't played in the Bulls' loss to the Sonics in the regular season. But ironically enough, the next time both teams met up in the regular season with Dennis Rodman in the starting lineup, the Chicago Bulls not only won that game, but also gave the Seattle SUPERSONICS their worst loss of the season. So now that the evidence has been presented and objections dealt with, there's some bitter truth that must also be acknowledged. One being that Michael Jordan was the face of the NBA, the MVP, a family man, and everything that the NBA wanted in its spokesman. Dennis Rodman, on the other hand, was a player who, after coming out of San Antonio, had a reputation for being a cancer in the locker room, and a player whose tattoos and hairstyles represented rebellion and went against everything the NBA was trying to market. Many fans' first exposure to Michael Jordan was during the 1991 NBA Finals, where he could be seen alongside his wife and father crying after winning his first NBA championship. so it was only fitting that on Father's Day, with his wife and children in attendance, that he be named the sentimental MVP of the 1996 NBA Finals. And while Michael Jordan was without a doubt the face of the NBA, Dennis Rodman during the 6 games that were the 1996 NBA Finals was the most impactful player for the Chicago Bulls and should have been named the 1996 NBA Finals MVP.
Rodman, they're chanting your name now. Rodman, Rodman. Did you simply impose your will there in the third quarter with all those rebounds and 5 points?
Well, I just think, say one thing. I just thank Chicago for having me in the city, and a lot of people never gave me any credit to be in this situation where I am today, but I proved them all wrong again. So you know.
Did you have some doubts? Did you think maybe, Dennis, this wouldn't work out as well as it has?
No, you know, I'm just happy to be here with somebody, with a city that likes to see someone work their ass off, and I just like to give back to the people.
Everybody wants to know about next year. There's been some questions. Do you feel as though you're going to be back here next year?
I don't know. It's just up to the. I promised the people one thing. I think I did it tonight. I hope that's what they want.